Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Cormac Kinsella, and this is the closing event today of the Saturday of the big weekend. You're all very welcome to the Dublin Festival of History. Our signers, Vanessa and Cormac, are with us they've been here for the day, and this is the fourth time I've been asked to slow down. So I'm really going to do my best for this one. We're here this evening to listen to Simon Jenkins talk about his new book, The Celts, A Sceptical History. Simon is the author of over 20 books, including the bestselling A Short History of England, A Short History of Europe, Thatcher and Sons, Accountable to None, Tory Nationalisation of Britain, and England's 1,000 Best Houses. He's the former editor of the Evening Standard and the Times, and is a columnist for The Guardian and a former chairman of the National Trust. We're going to hear this evening about his book, The Celts, A Sceptical History, and he's going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll open the floor to questions from you. So please don't have us hanging there. If anyone is thinking of a question now, just get it ready as soon as we ask you to put up your hands. After that, Simon will be available for book signing in the space if you go up to the left of the corridor. So the thesis of this book is that there never has been a distinct people, race, or tribe claiming the name of Celtic, though remnants of different languages and cultures remain throughout Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and Cornwall. The word keltoi first appears in Greek as applied generally to aliens or barbarians, and theories of Celticism continue to fuel many of the prejudices and misconceptions that divide the peoples of the British Isles to this day. Often seen as unimportant or irrelevant adjuncts to English history, in The Celts, Simon Jenkins offers a compelling counterargument. This is a fascinating and timely debate on who the Celts really were or weren't, and what their legacy should be for an increasingly disunited kingdom. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Simon Jenkins.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you all hear me? Can I just say, having come from London, what a huge pleasure it is to be back in Dublin. I'm a student of Georgian architecture, and there's no medical salvation quite like walking around Dublin, which I've just finished doing, where Georgians now look after a Georgian city, as London does not. Congratulations, Dublin. I love it. That's Dublin. I set out to do a book after doing short histories of England, London, and Europe, because somebody said, you're partly Celtic yourself, but why did you not mention them in your book on England? To which I said, because I was writing a short history of England. And like most books about Britain, they ignore completely anything that isn't England. And so I thought the only thing I can do about this is to write a short history of the Celts. That was 3 or 4 years ago. It is a source of complete fascination to me that the gulf between the popular conception of the population, prehistoric population of the British Isles and reality is so distant now. As I settled down to write a short history of the Celts, it was somewhat mystifying to find there weren't any. And the more I delved into it, and nothing I say in this book or now is me. It's perfectly respectable academically. All academics know more or less what I say is true, although aspects of it are very interestingly controversial. But the fact of the matter is that since the 1960s, 70s, Celticism, the idea of the Celts as a race or a people or a culture or whatever has been shot to ribbons. We're left with, rightly, the Irish, the Welsh, the Scots, the Bretons, and so on, who never have anything to do with each other. They're the most distant group of people. They don't even get together in Parliament. The Celts never do anything collectively. But there they are. They were the first inhabitants of the British Isles after the ancient Britons, whoever they were. And they came into existence in Europe in the 3rd century BC. They swept westwards. People are always sweeping in prehistory. They swept westwards, swept into the British Isles, obliterated the ancient Britons, creators of Stonehenge and so on, made them all speak Celtic, and stuck there as a sort of a lumpen people until the Romans came along. When the Romans left, the Celts were then swept alike by the Saxons, who invaded with appalling bloodthirsty massacres and genocide and made everybody speak English, except for the people they drove west, yet again, into the periphery of Cornwall, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. The problem with all this was, A, there was no archaeological evidence for any of this. A very interesting man called Graham Clark, professor of archaeology in the 60s, gave a famous lecture in which he said the Celts are a myth, and you shouldn't think that there's got to be an invasion for a society to change. There's not going to be an invasion for a new language to be spoken. Barry Cunliffe, a friend of mine, the great historian of the Celts, the great Celtic scholar, has undergone the most fascinating change as he's studied all this. He now wishes he'd called them the Celtic-speaking peoples, because there were people here before they spoke Celtic. He now wishes he'd called them the Atlantic-speaking peoples. There being so many Celtic languages, it's hard to describe them all as the same people. They're peoples anyway. Anyway, the point is, basically, that ever since the 60s, 70s, Tolkien, the great scholar, debunked the Celts completely. Then he made millions out of writing books about them called The Hobbits. But ever since then, there's been a steady demotion of the concept of the Celts. And the basis of that, and it's a very sort of powerful basis really, is the absolute absence of any evidence. There never was a race, a people, an empire, a king. There was no nation of the Celts. There was no one language. Even today, when the Celtic scholars get together, they have to speak English to each other because they don't speak the same language. And at the end of the day, as Malcolm Chapman wrote a famous book in the 1990s, could we please ban the word Celtic? That's where we got to. The second invasion, the Saxon invasion, was subject to exactly the same myth. Because of one person, Gildas, who wrote about it as a Welshman who loathed the English. The result was the theory of a Saxon invasion, battle, a sort of gigantic D-Day sort of crash into the shores of England, became the standard myth about how the Anglo-Saxons created England and pushed, beat, abused, shoved out the Celts from England. Now, there's no other case of a language arriving in a country and utterly eradicating the existing language. It just doesn't happen. Yet there's no trace of Celtic, almost none, in English. They are simply two completely different languages. It's almost inconceivable that people are speaking Celtic the whole way across the British Isles. Now, that's controversial, but that seems to me to make sense. So you have these two great invasions of the Celts and the Anglo-Saxons now dominating English history, British history. But the problem is, and you may reasonably say, all right, that's all very clever, does it really matter? Well, I think it does matter. By the time the Normans invaded, and that was a thundering great real invasion, they effectively conquered England. They then proceeded to conquer Wales, Scotland, and Ireland up to a point, and in doing so established the concept of an English empire, from Athelstan right to Edward I, in which the English were dominant. And because the English had what might be called the wealthier part of the islands, it was easier for them to become, so to speak, the dominant group, I don't like the word tribe, in the British Isles. And from then on, the English have written the story of ancient Britain around the concept of the English as superior in some sense or another. And the other lot, let's call them all Celts, a concept that only came into being in the 17th and 18th centuries when the language similarities suggested a race. But race was enough for the English. And by the 19th century, particularly the time of the Highland clearances and the Irish famine, the subsidiarity of the Celtic peoples to the Anglo-Saxons was ingrained in the English political psychology and stayed there ever since. And it matters today, this is all I really want to say on this subject from the beginning, it matters today because I genuinely don't believe, and I can say this as a half Englishman, half Welshman, that the English have really got it out of their system. It still is the case that the Celtic fringe, they love this ghastly phrase, the Celtic fringe, don't really deserve to be treated as the English are treated. They don't deserve their autonomy, in any sense of the word autonomy. The whole history of Europe, which is built around the concept of federalism, every country in Europe has got some sort of federal constitution whereby smaller groups within that country have degrees of autonomy sufficient to keep them consensual with the presiding constitution of that country. It has not applied to Britain. In Britain alone, we still have a union that isn't a union. Within the last 100 years, a chunk of it broke away, you lot in Ireland. The Scots now want to break away because they've seen you've done very well having broken away. The Union is unstable. A separatist party, whatever they like to call themselves, is in control of Scotland. Even Wales, my whole country, God help them. Some of them want to be independent, and a larger number each year want to be independent, whatever that means in Wales's case. But the Union of England, of Britain, of the United Kingdom, is unstable. And yet, your Prime Minister, the last one in London, could actually say devolution, even devolution, was a disaster. The Scots should never have been allowed to do it, nor should the Welsh. I don't know what's going to happen. I profoundly believe in the Union. I believe it was a tragedy when Ireland left the Union, for what it's worth. It seemed to me just an indication of the immaturity of British politics, that it couldn't keep a federation together, just of the islands off the shores of Europe. But here we are, still unstable. Ireland, to my mind, proves everything you want to know about autonomy, independence, federalism. The battle taking place in Scotland now, it's bitter, it's harsh. You go there, you have arguments all the time. You're getting them in Wales as well. This is not a stable union across the channel there. You've done it, you've proved how to do it. I'm not sure I'd want to do it again that way, but that's not my business. But anyway, it does matter that the Celts are, so to speak, subordinate to the British, the Anglo-Saxons, and it matters that in some sense or another they're lumped together. They've never liked being lumped together. They never lumped themselves together. Even in the House of Commons during Home Rule battles in the 19th century, the English, Welsh and Scots didn't combine in one coalition. They never combined against Athelstan. They didn't combine against Disraeli. So here we are. We should regard ourselves as proud Irishmen, Welshmen, Scotsmen and women against the proud Englishmen. But we are not a lumpen race any more than the English really are. Thank you very much.
You seem very far away. Is this? It's pretty good for cameras, though, is it?
We'll shout.
We'll shout. I just really want to start. I was very taken by what you were saying about the 19th century and 19th century scholars. I mean, it just seems like a historical swindle. Celtic studies, and why?
Well, one of the word Celtic only was associated with these diverse peoples in the 18th century, 19th century. By the 19th century, it had taken off right across Europe. I mean, Napoleon said, "I'm a Celtic governor. I'm a Celtic emperor." The Germans thought they were the original Celts. The French thought they were the original Celts. Of course, the word Gaul comes from Celts, so there's some plausibility in that. But it was so deep-dyed a belief that before the Romans, there was something called Celtic Europe. And the Latin and these various digs have revealed various things which are now called Celtic implements and Celtic style. That no one could quite believe it wasn't true.
Right.
And academic departments were set up, called Celtic Studies departments. And once you've set up an academic department, God forbid you ever disband it. That's all things.
And do you think there was a sense of 19th century, the Anglophone world, wanting to establish an idea of another, of people that weren't English, that weren't what we were, and we'll call them all something?
When you say the Anglophone world?
Well, the Anglophone historical world. I mean, the people who were starting to study this idea of Celticism.
Well, I mean, a lot of the early lecturers and studies of this subject tried to work out why the Celts had been invented.
Right.
They were invented simply because the various scholars in the 17th and 18th centuries had a man called Floyd, was one, a Welshman actually, had noticed that Welsh and Irish and Gaelic and Breton were similar. They assumed similarity of language meant similarity of race.
Right.
On the basis of that, they elevated Celtic into the language of a race. And once that had happened, it filled the void of what happened before Rome. I mean, the Vandals and the Goths came later. We know the people, Yamnayans came earlier, but no one knew what was going on in Europe before the Roman Empire started expanding. That's why Herodotus called them all Celts, which is foreigners, just meant foreigners. So it sort of there was a hole in knowledge, which the Celts filled. And once they'd filled it, it was very difficult to get them out.
And do you think was there any proper or rigorous study made of any Roman texts? to try and establish this?
Any Roman text?
Roman texts, yeah, like you mentioned, Herodotus.
Well, no, I mean, it was complicated by the fact the Romans always referred to tribes. There's a lot of work's been done on inscriptions. And Celtic inscriptions, very few and far between, because they didn't have a writing as such. And so everything's in Latin. And that's really no help, because the Romans simply recorded everything they were doing, wherever they were in Europe. And the thing about Latin was a universal language. Celtic wasn't. It's like saying they all spoke Slavic or they all spoke Scandinavian. It really is quite interesting. I was actually today in the History Museum here in Dublin, wonderful museum, in the prehistory department there. I go around these departments now. I say, can I see the word Celtic anywhere? No.
Right.
I mean, they don't exist, and I'm not the only person saying it. It's almost impossible when you've got a Celtic scholar somewhere around. Don't you do me down, sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. And do you think that's a feeling of inadequacy in history departments or within this kind of Irish, called Celtic studies?
Well, I don't know how many Celtic scholars there are in this room.
Yeah.
I'd be terrified of putting it as brutal as that.
Yeah.
All I'm doing is reporting what I've read.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm reporting what I've read.
Yeah.
And the scholarship ever since this revolution of DNA archaeology, which is, I didn't really mention it, but in the 1990s, DNA archaeology began to do what radiocarbon dating had done to wood, but it did it to skeletons.
Right.
And as radiocarbon dating could tell you more or less exactly when that tree was chopped down,
yeah.
skeleton can tell you more or less exactly where this person came from. And with every year, the science improves by leaps and bounds. And I think really what was happening was that people were so fascinated by the DNA archaeology, they didn't stop to say, what is this doing to the conventional wisdom?
Right.
And it was basically saying the people of Britain, British Isles in toto, arrived shortly after the Ice Age, and they've never left. They've been added to, migrated, all these things have happened, and at some stage a new language arrived. But broadly speaking, we've been on these islands for 6,000 years. And I don't really see why it's a problem. But it is a problem when you've got, it's a bit like real theology.
Yeah.
Once you've built up a whole sort of envelope of beliefs, it is very difficult to dismantle them. And I have to say, Barry Cunliffe, who I know well, and who's followed this whole saga through, I don't know, but I sense, has gone through real agonies of not I was wrong, but I've had to change my mind. As he said, every bloody week, something more comes in from the Reich laboratory in Harvard, from another skeleton someone's dumped in Harvard, and they come back and said, you've got it all wrong.
Right, yeah. And were there dissenters at the start? I mean, were there dissenters in the 19th century of people who are saying no? Were there dissenters in the studies, the 19th century studies? Was anyone saying, don't think so?
I don't know. I'm not a student of the Celtic department. But people I've spoken to who studied Celtic say, what you're telling us, we know.
Right.
Nothing new about this.
Okay.
What I find most extraordinary is if you, sometimes in England, I do a poll of who's in the room and say, how many people think there was a Celtic invasion? How many people think there was a Saxon invasion? Most people put up their hand.
Right.
Because that's how they've been taught. Or, it's extraordinary. The British Museum have a Celtic exhibition every 10 years. Mm. The BBC have a Celtic series every 5 years. And then they repeat it every 10 years. You cannot get away from the Celts. Yeah.
I recently rewatched Robert Key's great history of Ireland, or the Ireland television history from the early 80s. And that's got a couple of episodes on the Celts.
There we are.
So, that's it.
I mean, it just, whenever you see the word Celt, put in Irish.
Yeah.
What's wrong? Why can't you be Irish? Why do you have to be Celtic? I try to ask people why when you're doing a fashion shoot of Celtic fashion, or Celtic antiques, or Celtic food, always with that fancy lettering, Celtic.
Yeah.
Oh, it's slightly sort of slightly upper class than Irish or Welsh or whatever it is. It gives it a sort of spin. And I honestly think that's the answer to your question.
Really? Right. Mm. And what drew you? Was it through your other work, through your other books that you were writing? What drew you to this, to study the Celts?
The fact that I hadn't before.
Okay.
I was slightly guilty of the fact that the Oxford history of, I think it's the Oxford history of England. It's
Just
called
the one published
in
in
1930.
36, yeah.
I mentioned the thing. It starts off saying this is the history of the British Isles. It then says it's going to be history of all the British Isles, of England, Scotland, Wales, and so on, despite the title of the book across the top of the page.
Yeah.
It then completely ignores anything but England for the rest of the 10 volumes or whatever it is.
Right.
I say completely, but more or less ignores
Yeah.
it. And I'm not a particular champion of the other inhabitants of these islands, but it seems to me so outrageous. And it's causing Britain still so much trouble that we ought to disentangle it. And that's what I hope to do.
Right. Yeah. And you spoke in your talk of I think it's extraordinary that if you look at whatever, do with a Roman invasion, with the Saxon sweep, as you said, it's always a sweep, and then this Celtic sweep. And what theory or what evidence was put forward for this in the 19th century?
There was absolutely none.
Okay.
Actually, two things. One is that there was the language. People were fascinated by Celtic languages. They had nothing whatsoever to do with English. They had very little to do with the Romance languages, as they're called. Nothing with Scandinavian, Germanic languages. Nothing at all. And yet they've lived on in this extraordinary way, different, each one different. I mean, the different languages of England merged into English. Why didn't all the Celtic languages merge into a Celtic? When the Celtic scholars used to get together in the 1900s, these rather dotty old-fashioned antiquarians, they pleaded with each other to get an Esperanto, which is one Celtic. Absolutely hopeless.
Yes.
They just spoke English all the time.
Yeah.
But I mean, that I think, was a part of it.
And in that idea comes back to Benedict Anderson's great book, Imagine Communities, where he says there's no such thing as a nation, in the sense that there is just, and there's no such, we can't across a geographical space. All we can have it do is a notion of a community. And his theory was that you couldn't have this, I always think of the United States of America. I mean, it's 50 countries basically. It's very much like what Europe is now. Culturally from San Francisco to New York, it's vastly different culturally. And do you think that there was just a striving for a nationhood?
Well, there always is. It tends to come from the capital city.
Right, yeah.
I mean, you couldn't have a more centralized political culture than England and London.
Yeah.
And if you just read the debates about Irish Home Rule in the 19th century, I'm sure plenty of people have done much more of that than I have, the complete misunderstanding about Ireland. I mean, the utter lack of sympathy. Now, it was overlaid with Roman Catholicism and a fear of that, but the inability, but unwillingness to begin to understand why do subordinate communities, your word, want a degree of autonomy, and how do we fashion that autonomy? And at a time when all Europe was wrestling with federation, as I was saying, I mean, just how do you keep France together? Spain has enough trouble, but Spain is still kept together. I mean, Catalonia hasn't gone off. Yet.
Or the Basque Country,
we lost Ireland.
Yeah.
G.M. Young said it's the greatest disaster in British history, and I think it was.
And do you think also historically that great, the centralisation of London being the centre of this, very big island, and certainly in the 19th and early 20th century, Scotland and Wales were very far away from that centre. I mean, do you think that is part of it as well, just purely geographical?
Yes, it was. I mean, but coming back to your point about communities, when DNA archaeology was really getting going in the early 2000s, they did this fascinating people of Britain study, and they tried to distinguish the peoples of Britain by their DNA and how far back they went. And it was extraordinarily revelatory. But the most extraordinary thing was there was no English people, Welsh people, Scots people, Irish people. Right. There were groups of people in all these places, as there had been before the Romans arrived. Right. And they were very different. I mean, the Cornish and the Devonians are completely different peoples in DNA.
Right. Yeah.
The North and South Welsh have nothing in common. Yeah. Yorkshire and Lancashire don't bring them anywhere near each other. Interestingly, the psychology of these peoples today is still rather like that. The Devonians get on very well with Somerset, but not with Cornish. I don't know why, but right. I mean, I'm told that's really quite deep-seated. Yeah. The North and South Welsh hardly talk to each other.
Right. Bit like Cork and Dublin.
Well, I was going to ask, is that true in Ireland? But I mean, it's just as lumping them all together as Celtic, lumping them all together as Irish or Welsh is artificial.
Yeah.
But it derives from this desire for nationhood, which I think is a sort of craving that people have to ally themselves with neighbouring communities in some sense.
Yeah. And also the idea of borders as well. I mean, so would it make more sense to have, the borders along psychological lines or along language lines than where they are now?
Well, I mean, you probably know, the African countries still bitterly complain about having all their borders set by the European powers.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, why are there empires?
Yes.
They rise and they fall. Nations try to rise, fall, but then form a new constitution, which is why I'm fascinated by federalism. I mean, I think the way in which you get communities to live at peace with each other is by having a constitution that binds them together.
Right.
You mentioned America. The genius of the American Constitution is actually to be unfair. It gives individual states undue power just to keep them consensual with the United States as a whole.
Right.
And I don't know. I mean, people say, is it going to break apart? I don't know. It'll break apart because they cannot live together. But the Constitution of the United States is designed to help them to live together, even though they're very different. And that, I think, is the genius of America. I don't know whether it's going to work, but it illustrates to me the importance of federalism.
Yes.
And it's something the British have never learned.
Wow. And why do you think that is? Is that just...
It's a good question. I mean, as an English person, I'd say we're rather bright, but not bright enough.
Right.
I genuinely think it has to do... It does... I'm just spouting it. It has to do with the Normans.
Right.
I mean, the Normans brought to Britain unbelievable powers of organisation and potency. I mean, just keeping people in line. And they smashed people. They bribed the city. They killed the North. They left Irish to the South Welsh marcher lords and so on. I mean, it was an extraordinary operation. But by the time of Edward I, they were able to hold together what I call the first English Empire.
Right.
And it held. And never did that English Empire ever fail, and it's still in existence today, the English Empire. It's lost Ireland through sheer ineptitude. And I think genuinely there's something about the English. Partly it's a legacy of empire. We think that they're pretty well top nation. Yeah. And they can't quite believe that they can't keep their empires together. And when they let the empire go, it was a voluntary decision by the English to let the empire go. I mean, like hell, but that's how we tended to think. Right. And if you said to Boris Johnson, when he made that stupid remark, look, the English Empire is in as bad shape as the British Empire was, because you couldn't understand autonomy. I think he wouldn't have understood what I'm talking about.
Right. Yeah.
I just think he was, I mean, I could have preached him Greek city-state autonomy. It was a different matter. But as it was, you had a situation in which London honestly thought it could do no wrong. And the high point of that arrogance, which was the late 19th century, when Ireland was refused home rule, was a time when the whole empire was, so to speak, holding together. And the British just couldn't believe they couldn't rule the world.
Right, yeah. And what lessons do you think can be drawn from, as you say, this disunited kingdom you have today? I mean, what are those lessons that we could...
Well, the lesson is we've got to find a federal constitution.
Right.
I really do. I mean, it was quite interesting because when Alex Salmond negotiated with David Cameron the terms of the constitutional referendum, whatever it was, 2012 was it? Cameron said to him, "Would you like to have two questions, independence or Devo Light or Indy Light, whatever you wanted to call it, which involved basically total budgetary autonomy, as the Basques, I think, have, and a lot of the Swiss states have." I mean, a lot of people are studying this now. It's a fashionable subject. Yeah. And Alex Salmond thought to himself, he said, the trouble is, I want independence. I might not get it, but if I get Indy Light, I'm going to lose the subvention. I'm going to lose the subsidy. I'm going to be in charge of a country budget, which I can't possibly sustain, and I'll be chucked out by the electorate of Scotland. He didn't choose it. He denied it. The polls suggest he'd have won it. He'd have won Devo Light. Now, Devo Light is if you want to study this arcane subject, means basically you're entirely on your own financially.
Right.
as Ireland was in 1922. And it took Ireland a long while, as you know, to get over that. But the Scottish National Party are not prepared for that at all, and I know they're not. So they're terrified of Devo Light.
Right.
Independence would be cataclysmic in those terms, but at least they've got independence.
Right.
Now, I just think we've got to find a way of getting through this hurdle. It only really applies to Scotland. Wales is an implausible independent state.
Yeah.
But Scotland is plausible. It's the same size as Ireland, it's the same size as Denmark. Most countries in Europe are smaller than Scotland, not bigger than it. And so I think Scotland independence is perfectly plausible. I just think it'd be a tragedy if England becomes England and Wales.
Yeah, yeah.
Britain becomes England and Wales. I'm assuming that Northern Ireland joins Ireland,
Yeah.
if not in my
Yeah.
lifetime, in someone else's lifetime. And so it should. So you can conceive of a sensible British Isles with Ireland as a whole, Great Britain intact.
Right.
But it's at least conceivable that it'll lose Scotland. And then it'll look very odd.
Right. Yeah. Can we go back to the Normans? I'm very interested in what you said about the Normans as the, if you like, the foundation of what we now have as this federal state that you have. And do you think that was the foundation of that very strong federal state? Did that contribute to this idea of the Celtic mysticism? Because everyone else was outside that? Everyone else in the group of islands were outside that?
Outside what? Sorry,
outside this, like it was so London-centric, this Norman federal state. And do you think everyone just outside that was considered Celtic and considered just literally beyond the pale?
Because the terminology had no historic validity, it became a useful term to use when I think Macaulay and people who were writing about Ireland and Scotland at the time of the famine.
Yeah.
I mean, basically said they deserve it. You know, these people are inferior race, they deserve it. And this was a term applied to the Celtic peoples, plural, I think, plural then. And in a sense, from that, all disasters ensued, as far as Ireland was concerned. But I don't know. I mean, it's a very curious thing. When you've got a concept that doesn't have any validity, it'll light on anything that can pick it up and use it. And it's like the Celtic fringe, which is an awful phrase.
Yeah.
But there's no such thing, and there's no unity behind it. There's no point in it. I just think somehow or another it'd be much better if the English, properly so called, which includes the Cumbrians and Northumbrians,
Yes,
plenty of Strathclyde, there's plenty of people who are Celtic speaking.
Yeah.
If the English just recognise that there are parts of the British Isles, or British Isles other than Ireland, there are parts of it which ought to be treated differently. It might include Yorkshire, it might include Cornwall for that matter, from the way in which you're running this country now. And the way it's being run now, I have to say, in my lifetime, never worse than now.
Yeah.
It really is getting to the point now where I think a lot of people in London are saying we need a new sort of constitution. The House of Lords is meaningless. There's no autonomy to local councils. They're being starved of money. They can't raise enough money. Social services are collapsing. The NHS is in deep trouble. These are all consequences, to my mind, of the over-centralisation of government in London. Right. And they've got to find a way of devolving it.
Right. We have 2 roving mics, if anyone would like to ask a question. Wow, 1, 2, 3. 1. Will you just wait for a sec till the mic comes to you? Just here. This man here, just to your right, hand up. Yeah, put your hand up again. Yeah, great. Thank you.
I'm just fascinated by how many times you have used the term British Isles. And I'm struck that you speak from a very, though you're half Welsh, from a very Anglo-centric point of view. And your sense of loss, that Britain lost Ireland. Whatever, and the concept of Celt seems to be a headline for you. So you say that, but really most of what you've just spoken of is about modern politics and how the United Kingdom, such as it is, should or shouldn't be governed. But there is, and I don't know that many people in Ireland are particularly exercised about whether there is a Celtic culture or not. We have an Irish culture, and certainly we have an Irish language, and in that headline, music, language, and so forth, is under that broad umbrella of Celt. But I don't think people are as exercised about the notion of Celts as you may be.
Well, in that case, I can fall silent. I think you're right. I often ask my Welsh friends and my Scots and Irish friends, do you ever call yourself Celtic? No. People aren't exercised about it, you're quite right. But academics are, and London government is, because it's the term they use for the problem areas, let's put it that way. And I can't make any more of it than that. One day, perhaps we'll never use the word Celtic again, which a lot of people will be very too pleased about.
I'm so pleased you raised that point about British Isles. That was going to be one of the points I was going to make. It's a rather sensitive term over here. We prefer Britain and Ireland. As an archaeology student in the 70s, I can confirm that I was taught that there was no such thing as the Celts. You know, that there was no people, no invasion. So it's not a new concept. So I was kind of interested to see your book on that subject as well. So some of us would have been in agreement with you for a long time. There was Celtic art. There was a pattern of art which could be identified stretching from, say, Hallstatt in Austria, and the same patterns turning up across France, Britain, and Ireland. So that would have been part of the basis for that 19th century label of being attached to it, whereas we now know, of course, that, you know, cultural developments don't necessarily require invasions. My last point would be that the question of Britain losing Ireland, the Union only existed from 1800. That's only 220 years out of a long time relationship between the two islands, and the Union was kind of bought. So I don't think it was ever really a thing.
Well, it wasn't a union, it was a colony. I mean, it was governed. Well, I'm trying to describe. I tell you one thing. You write about this subject. Nomenclature is a nightmare. Most people, in my country, refer to the British Isles as a geographical entity called the British Isles. No, we named it. I'm British. I use the word only because it's in every atlas. Anyway, but I take your point totally, all right, but I mean, you begin to have to, if you don't use the word Celtic, you have to put English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, every single time you use the word Celtic. One thing I must say I've liked about reading about Ireland in all this is how much more relaxed you are on that sort of sensitivity compared to the Welsh and the Scots, who drive you out of the room if you say one word wrong. That year use of the word wrong is as woke as it gets. But going back to the point you make about art, I mean, it is interesting to me, as I think I said, where you do find Celtic used. I mean, there's a great controversy now about Celtic Christianity. I mean, Celtic Christianity was a sort of Christianity. It did apply to Ireland, Scotland, Lindisfarne, down the east coast of Britain, England. It did have things in common. I gather now it's now being debunked. I mean, it was really Irish Christianity. It was not Celtic Christianity. In the case of the sort of post-Beaker culture implements and shields and so on, they are similar. But that doesn't mean there was a Celtic empire that created them. And Hallstatt and Latane now are regarded as completely independent cultures in the corner of the Alps there. I'm delighted to hear you were taught the right thing. And I'm not inventing anything. I'm just reading the same things that you're probably reading. But it is extraordinary to me that the Celtic studies community have been unable to persuade almost anyone, including the British Museum and the BBC, that they're wrong and the other side.
I don't know about the Normans. Doesn't it predate?
Can we just wait just...
A shouted question, doesn't it all predate the Normans? What is it?
What about the Romans? They weren't in Ireland really at all, and they were hugely influential in England. Maybe it predates the Normans.
What, the concept of Celticness?
The culture that made certain parts of Ireland Wales, Scotland, kind of blend together, and didn't the Romans go into Wales and just finish off the Druids completely, and maybe some of those peoples kind of held together in some kind of, song and art and language that it's similar, it's not exactly the same, but it might actually be what bonded them before the Normans ever, were going to organise themselves.
Yes, that is true. I mean, except for the Welsh. I mean, the Welsh were regarded as more Roman than the Romans.
After the Druids
well, we don't know the Druids. We don't know if the Druids. Tacitus said they were killed, but I mean, we don't quite know who the Druids. I mean, the Celtic Christianity was called. They called themselves Druids sometimes. I mean, they were part of that sort of culture. But no, you're quite right. Not to have been conquered by Rome was quite important to Ireland and Scotland, I mean, historically. And I think that sense of differentness survived from that. The Cornish sort of weren't. Strathclyde survived quite a long while after that. I just find this whole business of trying to lump together individual communities who are very different, actually, although you're quite right, they have some myths in common or whatever. And apart from anything else, I mean, my mother had ancestors on Teesside who'd taught their children to count sheep, Yantan Tethera. Yantan Tethera is Cymric, and it's quite unlike Welsh, un dau tri, pedwar. Pedwar is Tethera. They're clearly related but different. And you just suddenly realize that there was a huge richness of these local cultures right across England, as well as what was elsewhere. And it just seems to me so sad they got lumped together in this way.
Wait for the mic, please. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I happen to agree with you about the Celts. But I think what happened is when Ireland lost Britain in 1922, we had this idea of a nation building that didn't involve England or anything to do with the English. So we created a culture and an identity going back to this group of people called the Celts, because, to admit that there were Vikings, I mean, we buried our Viking archaeology. To admit there were Normans, we'd have to admit there were Romans, there were English. It didn't fit in with the dialogue of the period. But what fascinates me is when I don't agree that they were a homogenous group of people, but there are also traditions that are shared. My mother, for instance, was from Yorkshire. I grew up thinking there was England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Yorkshire. And my father was from Cork. And they both had this tradition called first footing, which was on the Celtic New Year's Eve, the first person through your door had to be a dark-haired man carrying a lump of coal. And when I looked into that, that was also a Celtic tradition, say, in Germany. So it wasn't also always about language and stuff. There were these traditions that has been shared throughout the British Isles that link us as well. Have you any kind of comment on that?
Well, what you're saying is that lots of different cultures have similar traditions, which I think is unexceptionable. I agree. Why one needs to put the word Celtic in front of the ones because they occur in two different countries, I don't follow. I read Malcolm Chapman's book about the myth of the Celts. It's a devastating book. It's back in '92, I think. But he simply says, if you just take the word Celtic out of every sentence, you haven't lost anything. There are diverse communities, or were diverse communities, and still, to an extent that London can't handle, are diverse communities everywhere. You've got to recognize that they have rights of their own as communities. You've got to give them some powers to govern their lives as communities. And central governments never like that. I imagine it's the same with the Dublin government, I don't know. But I mean, the fact is that central governments don't like local gestures of independence. And it's always been that way. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, empires build up and they collapse. And what's new?
Good evening. Thank you very much for the lecture. And it's interesting how different people are hearing different things from the same conversation, which I appreciate. And it's a lot of great points were raised, and great that the previous speakers said partially what I wanted to say. It's just, you see, because we live now on an island, and we think Celtic from perspective of Twilight and everything, and for us it's one meaning, which is very narrow compared to what, say, French people would mean by Celtic, who drew the comic, you know, introduced Asterix and Obelix, created Revue Celtique, which was basically like a, you know, alma mater of Celtic studies, as well as in Germany, you know, the very kind of light that was brought into Celtic studies and description of all the Celtic languages from continental perspective. And I'm just thinking how fascinating it is that, like, so many years later, with marketing and revolutionary moods that raised to creation of certain countries right now, including this one, how this term is still kind of uniting people throughout like 1,000 years after all those old roots have been long gone. I mean, before even Roman Empire, you know, and all this romanticism that raised the whole concept back again. So thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting.
Thank you for your comment. I can't add to it, but thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure this out from an archaeological, historical, and maybe biblical context. So we know from archaeology we have our court tombs, our passage tombs, and our dolmens, all happening between 4000 BC and 1500 BC. And then we have a record of copper mining from the Cantabrian Spanish coming across to Kerry, doing copper mining at 2400 BC, and then moving across to Wales 1800 BC. All an ancient civilization, all a people that are on the landscape before anything that you've mentioned there. And then we come to the history of the English, and somewhere or other they say that the Samotheans ruled Gaul. And from Samothea you get Druid, Bardus, Lucas, and Celtus. Celtus being a Celt. And at his time, Albion took over England. And from him, Hercules came in and made Corona. And from him, Celtus came back and took over the land. As an oral tradition, to try and keep the tale going, you need a storyline. So maybe that is the Hollywood of their time, trying to keep a tradition going. But then you have the biblical record from Japhet, where they say that 5 of Japhet's sons have to come across Europe and take over Europe. The Celtic Iberians, the Celtic Gauls, the Celtic Yugoslavians, and the Celtic Italians. How many more Celts do you want in the record before we get to Aristotle saying, watch those keltois coming down, they're going to take over the Greeks. So we have all this storyline, but apart from all that, you have, from Gomer coming across, you have this tale of the Gaelic Indo-European language, which is in Gaul, which is in Armonica, in Spain, in Wales, in Cornwall, in Scotland, and the 4 provinces of Ireland, Leinster, Munster, Ulster, and Connacht. And that's our storyline, and we've held it. And somehow or other, it's been transmitted down to us. So you're saying it's all a tale of woe and forget it. Or are we trying to say that we on the Western seaboard have a history, have a culture, have a people that have been here and always have been?
I'm saying precisely the last point, yes. I mean, and the references to Hollywood have very correctly described some of the previous myths which surround the peopling of Europe. There was a great problem before the Roman Empire. What on earth was going on in Europe? And the concept of the Celts splendidly filled that yawning gap. And it's now fed itself into as you say, the Welsh and the Scottish Iolo Morgannwg and those people in the 18th century, they created all these myths around Wales and MacGregor around Scotland, which were phenomenal myths. They were fantastic myths. They were great. They were terrific. They explained an awful lot about the past of the people who didn't know their past. But I'm not doing it. I'm reporting people who are trying to find their way through this fog of glorious myth to find out what was the reality of it. A lot of people criticize my book for not dealing with myths enough. I wasn't supposed to be dealing with myths. I was trying to debunk myths. I've got no problem with myths. I love the myths. It's terrific. That wasn't what I was trying to describe. I was trying to describe what might have been the case.
One more question, just to let you know, it's the last question.
This one here on the left-hand side. Yeah.
Hello, I'm just wondering, like, what facts are there in your book other than saying no? Like, is there anything in there that offers what the answer is? Like, say, what is the answer to where the languages came about, and like in order to debunk, the book has to have something else to say. Well, this is what really happened. This is what it was. Is there any answer?
I don't quite see the question. Sorry.
Well, no, it's just that, like. Like, is the book just one giant thesis that says there is no Celts? But is there do you offer any other solutions to what it was and like how the language came about if it wasn't from conquest, etc.?
Well, I mean, the theory of the origin of the Celtic languages is been hotly studied by Colin Renfrew and others. The theory is it came up from Iberia, as someone was mentioning. It came across the Mediterranean, touched Italy, Spain, France, the Iberian Peninsula, moved up. Probably it was the lingua franca of trade. Some people have called it the language of the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age was the great burst of trade in Europe. It needed a language so people could talk to each other. You need a language if you're trading with people. The Celtic languages appeared to be that. And that's how these languages came up the west coast of Europe to Ireland, Cornwall Island, and probably only the west coast of the British Isles. That's a very controversial point of view. The really most interesting question now is, what did the whole of England speak when the Romans arrived? I mean, did they really all speak a Celtic tongue, Brythonic and Goidelic and the various versions of Celtic? Or did they always on the east side speak some form of Germanic, which would have made sense because the way in which you see these civilizations now is to see, it's called sea as land. Sea is permeable. Sea is what you cross in days and months, or sorry, in weeks or days. Land takes months to cross. So the North Sea was one cultural area, probably a linguistic area as well, while the Irish Sea is the same. Why there are close contacts between Ireland and Wales right throughout these periods? Because they were in some sense one people. They were the people of the Irish Sea. And the people of the North Sea, I think, would probably have been speaking a similar language on the west and east side of the North Sea. And at that point, you say to yourself, well, that explains so much. It explains why English caught on the east side of Britain. It explains why there's so little Celtic in English. We know their place names and so on. There have been all sorts of studies of this. But it's a great puzzle. It's been called the greatest puzzle of prehistory. Is what did the British Isles and Ireland really speak right back in time? And I just think it's wonderful. It's bottomless. It's for an outsider to come to. It was fascinating to me. To say, good heavens, they haven't worked this one out yet. I'll have a stab at it. It is. I just find it intellectually a fascinating thing to investigate. But at the end of it, and I come back to where I started, it does matter politically. I mean, Ireland came up with the answer in 1922. It took 50 years, and Ireland now has proved everything that English said about Ireland in the 19th century wrong, including wrong about Home Rule. And I mean, in the book, I'm afraid I eulogize Ireland a bit because Ireland got it right in the terms in which the debate was then being conducted. And I'm afraid a lot of people in Scotland see Ireland and say that's the way we want to go. And although it's not the end of the world if Scotland goes independent, not the end of the world if Wales goes independent, end of Wales, well, it's a different matter. But I just think to myself, when a people with so much in common historically as the people of these islands cannot live together in one sort of political unity, it's a sort of tragedy. And that tragedy is continuing.
At that point, I think we should wrap it up and say thanks very much to Simon. And to say, The Celts is on sale. Marta from the Gutter Bookshop is outside. Simon will be signing in the room at the end of the corridor. And please pick up a programme. We have another great day of events tomorrow. Thanks again.